There was a moment in deep history when the future of humanity balanced on the edge of silence. A moment when only a few thousand humans remained on the entire planet. A moment when one disaster could have erased our story before it was ever written. This is the story of that forgotten day. Long before cities rose from stone, before kings ruled from golden thrones, before temples reached toward the sky, the world belonged to the wind, the rivers, and the wandering tribes of early humans. They walked across open plains where tall grass moved like ocean waves beneath endless skies. They followed herds along ancient paths carved into the land by time itself. They slept beside small fires that flickered gently against the darkness of the wild. These people had no maps, no written words, no monuments carved into mountains, only memory, only stories whispered beside firelight, only the rhythm of seasons and the slow turning of the earth. They lived lightly upon the land. Stone tools shaped by patient hands, hides stretched over wooden frames, shelters built from branches, bone, and earth. They listened to birds calling at dawn. They watched clouds gather on distant horizons. They learned the paths of rivers and the shelter of caves. This was humanity in its earliest age. Not rulers of the planet, not builders of empires, but fragile travelers moving through a vast and powerful world. Every sunrise was a gift, every storm a warning, every winter a trial. And yet, for tens of thousands of years, they survived. They crossed deserts where the sand burned beneath their feet. They climbed mountains wrapped in ice and cloud. They followed coastlines where waves whispered ancient songs. From Africa into the Middle East, from Asia into Europe, from Siberia into frozen lands of endless white. Humanity was learning to live everywhere. But the earth was preparing a challenge greater than any hunt, greater than any storm, greater than any winter. A challenge written not in wind or rain, but in fire. Deep beneath the surface of the planet, something ancient began to awaken, a force that had slept for hundreds of thousands of years, a force older than memory, a force powerful enough to darken the sky itself. And soon the world would no longer feel familiar. Soon the sun would fade behind ash. Soon the air would grow thin and cold. Soon humanity would face its greatest test, not as tribes, not as families, but as a species. For countless generations, the earth had followed a rhythm that felt eternal. Seasons came and went. Rains fed the rivers. Grass returned after fire. Herds followed ancient paths across the plains. The world felt stable, predictable, alive in its quiet balance. But deep beneath the surface of the planet, far below forests and oceans, a giant was slowly awakening. Beneath what is now the island of Sumatra, a vast chamber of molten rock began to swell. Pressure built in silence. Heat gathered in darkness. The land above showed no warning. Rivers still flowed. Animals still migrated. The sky still turned blue at dawn and red at sunset. And yet the earth was changing.
Small tremors rolled through the ground like distant thunder. Lakes warmed from below. Strange gases whispered from cracks in the stone. Early humans could not know what these signs meant. They felt the ground tremble beneath their feet. They heard strange echoes in the hills. They saw steam rising from places where no fire burned. Some believed the spirits were restless. Some believed the gods were angry. Some believed the world itself was breathing. They gathered closer to their fires at night. They watched the stars more carefully. They listened to the silence between the winds. The animals sensed it too. Herds shifted their routes. Birds changed their nesting grounds. Creatures of the forest moved toward the coast. The earth was preparing for a moment that would reshape the sky. Far beneath the soil, the pressure grew unbearable. The chamber expanded. The rock fractured. The crust of the planet began to weaken. This was not an ordinary volcano. This was something far larger, a supervolcano, a force capable of darkening the world, a force capable of changing climate across continents, a force powerful enough to place humanity on the edge of extinction. But on the surface, life continued. Families followed the herds. Children learned to shape stone. Elders told stories beside flickering flames. No one knew that the sky would soon turn black. No one knew that the sun would disappear. No one knew that the air itself would grow cold and thin. The earth was silent, and silence always comes before the storm.
The day humanity almost went extinct, when the sky turned dark. The earth did not warn the world with fire at first. It warned with silence. The birds stopped singing at dawn. The winds grew strangely still. The air felt heavy, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Then, deep beneath the forests and oceans, the planet broke. A sound like distant thunder rolled through the land. The ground trembled beneath the feet of hunters and gatherers. Rivers shivered along their banks. And then the sky changed. Far to the south, a dark cloud rose above the horizon. It did not move like a storm. It did not fade like mist. It climbed. Higher than any mountain, wider than any river valley, darker than the deepest night. The supervolcano had awakened. From the heart of the earth, fire and ash were thrown into the sky. Stone melted into rivers of glowing rock. The air filled with fine gray dust that drifted like falling snow. Day slowly turned into twilight. Twilight turned into shadow. Shadow turned into night. The sun disappeared behind a veil of ash. Across thousands of kilometers, the sky grew dim. Across continents, the world cooled. Across oceans, the winds carried darkness. Early humans watched in silence. They had never seen the sun vanish at noon. They had never felt cold winds in the middle of warm seasons. They had never tasted ash in the air. Fires struggled to burn. Plants wilted beneath the darkened sky. Animals grew restless and afraid. Ash settled on rivers and lakes. It covered the grasslands. It coated the forests. The earth, once bright and alive, became gray. Some believed the sky was dying. Some believed the gods had turned away. Some believed the world was ending. And for humanity, it almost was. Because the darkness did not pass in a day. It did not fade in a week. It did not lift in a month. The ash remained. The cold deepened. And the long winter of the earth began. The darkness did not lift with the passing of days. It settled into the world like a heavy cloak. The sky remained pale and dim, as if the sun had forgotten how to shine. The air carried the scent of smoke and stone. Fine ash drifted across valleys and rivers, coating the land in silent gray. Seasons lost their meaning. Summer no longer brought warmth. Winter no longer brought snow. Only cold winds moved across empty plains. The great herds vanished first. Animals that once crossed the land in endless lines now walked thin and slow. Many collapsed beside dry riverbeds. Others wandered without direction, searching for grass that no longer grew. Plants withered beneath the weak light. Fruits failed to ripen. Seeds lay frozen in the soil. For early humans, every journey became dangerous. Hunting grounds turned empty. Rivers ran low. The forests grew quiet. Fires became precious. Small flames flickered against the cold, fed by carefully gathered wood. Families huddled close together beneath hides and branches. Children listened as the wind whispered through the dark. Food became rare. People walked farther each day. They searched deeper into valleys. They climbed higher into the hills. They followed animals that still survived. They dug for roots beneath frozen soil. They learned to preserve every piece of meat. The world had become a test. Those who adapted lived. Those who could not were left behind. Small groups began to gather together. Where once families traveled alone, now clans formed. Where once voices echoed across plains, now silence ruled. The earth had entered a new age. An age of cold. An age of hunger. An age where survival itself was uncertain. And somewhere beneath the endless clouds, humanity walked forward, not knowing if the sun would ever return, not knowing if the world would ever grow warm again, not knowing if their children would see a brighter sky. They moved because they had no choice, because life, even in darkness, refused to fade. The age of survival. The world no longer offered comfort. The land that once fed entire tribes now gave only fragments of life. The rivers ran thin beneath pale skies. The forests whispered with empty branches. And yet, humanity endured. People learned to read the new language of the earth. They watched the movement of clouds. They listened to the wind across frozen plains. They followed the paths of animals that still remembered where water flowed. Every step became a calculation. Every fire a treasure. Every hunt a moment of hope. The old ways were no longer enough. Stone tools were sharpened more carefully. Clothing was stitched thicker and layered against the cold. Shelters were built deeper into hills and caves, where the earth still held warmth. Families gathered closer at night. Stories were told not just to remember the past, but to remind each other why they must survive. Children listened to tales of green fields and warm sun, trying to imagine a world they had never seen. The elders spoke of seasons that once brought flowers, of rivers filled with fish, of skies so blue they seemed endless. Those memories became fuel. Small groups joined into larger clans. Hunters shared their knowledge. Scouts mapped hidden valleys and sheltered forests. Humanity began to think together, not as scattered tribes, but as a single moving force across a changing world. In the long cold, cooperation became the strongest weapon. Food was shared. Warmth was shared. Hope was shared. And slowly, quietly, humanity adapted. The species that once followed the rhythm of the earth now learned to survive its silence. But far across the frozen lands, another danger waited. Because the cold was not finished. The ash still hung in the sky, and the world had not yet reached its darkest hour. The cold that would not end. The sky remained pale for years. Clouds drifted slowly across a world that no longer felt alive. The sun rose weak and distant, like a fading memory. The winds carried the breath of ice across valleys and plains. The earth had entered a long season without warmth. Glaciers crept forward from the north. Frozen rivers cut through the land like white scars. Forests retreated into sheltered valleys where a little green still survived. For humanity, every journey became longer. People followed the edges of ice where animals still wandered. They searched for caves where warmth lingered beneath stone. They crossed open plains where the wind never rested. Many did not survive. The old and the weak were the first to fall behind. Hunger hollowed faces. Cold stiffened tired hands. The world was becoming smaller. Where once humans spread across continents, now only a few scattered regions still offered life. Coasts where the sea softened the cold. Valleys where rivers still flowed beneath thin ice. Forests where animals found shelter. Small groups disappeared into the darkness of history. Their fires went out. Their voices faded. Their footsteps vanished beneath snow and ash. Those who remained learned to travel farther and live lighter.
They carried only what they could protect. They memorized every valley, every ridge, every hidden spring. They moved with the seasons that no longer felt like seasons at all. The earth had become a test of endurance, and humanity was failing. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, until only a fragile thread of life still walked beneath the gray sky, a thread that could break at any moment.
When the world grew empty, there came a time when the earth felt too large for the few who still walked upon it. Vast plains stretched without footprints. Forests stood silent without voices. Rivers flowed past empty camps where fires once burned. The world had not only grown cold, it had grown empty. Humanity was no longer spread across continents, no longer scattered across mountains and coastlines, no longer following endless herds across open land. Now only a few fragile pockets of life remained. Small groups clung to valleys where water still flowed. Others sheltered along coastlines where the sea softened the frost. Some hid in forests that held warmth beneath thick trees. Between these islands of survival lay vast distances of frozen land. Journeys that once took days now took weeks. Paths once filled with life now led only to silence. Many who set out never returned. Those who survived learned to move with care. They followed the stars across open plains. They marked stones and trees to guide their way home. They memorized every bend in the river and every shelter in the hills. Each meeting between groups became rare. When they did meet, they shared stories. They shared food. They shared hope. They spoke of lands farther south where warmth still lingered, of coastlines where fish still filled the sea, of forests where animals still found refuge. These stories became maps of survival. But even these last safe places were changing. The cold reached deeper each year. Storms grew stronger. The ice moved closer. The earth was closing its doors, and humanity stood at the threshold, not knowing if there would be another season, not knowing if there would be another generation, not knowing if the story of their species would end in silence. Yet they walked forward, because even when the world feels empty, the will to live remains. There was a time when the human world could fit inside a single valley. Not in distance, not in land, but in number. The great migrations had ended. The long journeys had slowed. The scattered tribes had gathered where survival was still possible. Across the vast continents, only a few thousand humans remained. Some lived along warm coastlines where the sea still offered food. Some sheltered in river valleys where water still flowed beneath thin ice. Some hid in forests where animals found refuge from the cold. Between these last places of life lay endless silence. Frozen plains stretched without firelight. Mountains stood without paths. Rivers ran without canoes. The earth had become too large for the few who still walked upon it. Families grew small. Children were rare. Every birth was a miracle. Elders watched the sky each morning, searching for signs of warmth. Hunters walked farther each season, following animals that were themselves struggling to survive. Gatherers searched deeper into valleys for roots and seeds hidden beneath frozen soil. Every day became a calculation. How far to travel, how much to carry, where to find shelter before nightfall. The cold shaped every decision. The hunger shaped every dream. And yet, humanity endured. Not through strength, not through dominance, but through patience. They learned to wait for the right moment to hunt. They learned to preserve food through long seasons. They learned to read the land like a living map. The species that would one day build cities and sail oceans now lived one day at a time. A fragile thread of life stretched across a frozen world. And if that thread had broken, there would be no voices left to remember, no stories to tell, no future to unfold. But the earth was not finished, and neither was humanity. The first signs of return. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world began to change. The sky remained pale, but the darkness no longer deepened. The winds still carried cold, but the storms grew shorter. The sun lingered a little longer above the horizon each day. For the first time in many years, the earth was no longer growing colder. In sheltered valleys, thin grass pushed through frozen soil. Along coastlines, fish returned to shallow waters. In forests, animals began to follow new paths. The world was breathing again. The people noticed the change. Hunters returned from long journeys with fuller packs. Children played longer outside the shelters. Fires burned brighter with new hope. The elders spoke softly of a time before the cold, of warm rivers and endless green fields, of skies so clear they seemed to stretch forever. Now those memories no longer felt like dreams. Small groups began to move outward once more. They followed rivers into lands long abandoned. They crossed plains where silence had ruled for years. They climbed hills that had once been buried beneath snow. The earth still carried scars. Ash lay hidden beneath new soil. Ice still crowned distant mountains. The forests remained thin and young. But life had returned. And with it, humanity began to remember how to grow. Families expanded. Children were born into a world that no longer felt entirely hostile. Stories changed from survival to possibility. The great journey of humanity, once paused by ice and fire, had begun again. But the memory of near extinction remained, etched into bones, carried in blood, whispered through generations.
a reminder that even the strongest species can vanish, and that survival is never guaranteed.
The world did not return all at once. It healed slowly, like a deep wound closing over centuries. Ice still crowned distant mountains. Cold winds still crossed the plains. But rivers flowed stronger each year. Forests grew thicker. Animals returned to ancient paths. Humanity followed. Small groups began to walk beyond the last safe valleys. They crossed lands that had been silent for generations. They followed rivers that once again carried life. Footprints returned to empty plains. Fires burned where only frost had ruled. Voices echoed in valleys that had known only wind. The great journey had begun again. Families carried children on their backs. Hunters followed herds across open grasslands. Gatherers searched for plants that had not grown in memory. The earth was no longer an enemy. It was a teacher. People learned where floods would rise. They learned where animals gathered. They learned where the soil was rich and warm. Every new camp was a small victory. Shelters were built near rivers. Fire pits were carved into stone. Paths were marked across hills and forests. The map of humanity was being drawn once more. Slowly, the world grew louder. Birds returned to the sky. Insects filled the air with quiet sound. Waves whispered along the coast. The silence of extinction was fading, but the memory of the Dark Age remained, carried in stories told beside the fire, carried in scars left by hunger and cold, carried in the careful way people watched the sky. They knew now how close they had come, how fragile life could be, and how easily the world could change. The earth had spared them, but it had also warned them. The future would belong only to those who remembered. The earth welcomed humanity back with quiet patience. The land was not the same as before. Rivers followed new paths. Forests stood younger and thinner. Mountains carried deeper crowns of ice. But life had returned. In valleys once buried beneath frost, wrasse now moved gently in the wind. Along coastlines, waves carried fish back into shallow waters. Across open plains, herds slowly gathered once more. Humanity walked carefully into this reborn world. Every step carried memory. Every decision carried caution. Every fire burned with gratitude. The people built their camps close to water. They followed animals that had learned the land again. They gathered seeds from fields that had not known footsteps in generations. Children were born into a world that felt wide and full of promise. They listened to stories of the long darkness as if hearing legends from another age. They watched the sky with wonder, not fear. The elders still remembered. They remembered cold winds that never rested. They remembered hunger that hollowed the land. They remembered a sky that hid the sun. And so they taught the young to watch the earth, to respect the rivers, to listen to the forests, to read the movement of clouds. The species that once walked on the edge of extinction now stepped into a fragile dawn. Humanity was no longer only surviving, it was living again. But the scars of the past remained, etched into memory, carried in instinct, written into the bones of every generation. A reminder that even the brightest future can fade, that even the strongest species can fall, and that survival is a gift that must never be taken for granted. The earth had given humanity another chance, and this time they would remember. The memory that never faded. Even as the world healed, the memory of darkness did not disappear. It lived in stories told beside the fire. It lived in the careful way people watched the sky. It lived in the respect they gave to the changing seasons. Long after the ash had settled and the ice had retreated, humanity remembered. They remembered a time when the sun vanished. They remembered a time when the cold ruled the land. They remembered a time when life nearly slipped away. These memories became myths. In some lands, people spoke of a great fire from the earth that swallowed the sky. In others, they told of a winter that lasted for generations. Some spoke of angry gods who covered the world in darkness. Others of spirits who hid the sun behind clouds of stone. But beneath every story lived the same truth. The world had once almost ended, and humanity survived. The memory shaped the way people lived. They built shelters stronger than before. They stored food for seasons that might never come. They honored the sun when it rose and the rain when it fell. They feared the silence of the sky. They feared the breath of the mountains. They learned that the earth could change without warning. And so they watched. They watched the horizon. They listened to the winds. They read the stars for signs. The past taught them that survival was never guaranteed. Every generation carried the weight of that lesson. A lesson written not in stone, but in memory. And even as cities would one day rise, and temples would touch the clouds, and empires would spread across continents, the ancient fear would remain. A quiet voice reminding humanity, the earth is powerful, the sky is fragile, and life is a gift that can vanish in silence. With each passing generation, the earth opened itself once more. Ice withdrew into the highest mountains. Forests spread across valleys and hills. Rivers carved fresh paths through fertile plains. The scars of fire and ash faded into soil, and humanity followed. People walked beyond the lands their ancestors had known. They crossed plains where silence once ruled. They entered forests that had grown where ice once slept. The Great Migration resumed. From Africa into distant lands, from warm coasts into high valleys, from rivers into forests and open grasslands. Human footsteps returned to the world. New camps rose beside rivers. Stone circles marked gathering places. Paths connected valleys that had never known travelers before. The planet felt wide again. Children grew up beneath open skies. Hunters followed herds across endless plains. Gatherers learned the language of new forests. The memory of extinction slowly softened. The fear of endless winter faded into legend. The stories of dark skies became myth. The long silence of the earth turned into distant echo. But deep within humanity, something had changed forever. They had learned the cost of fragility. They had learned the power of cooperation. They had learned the strength of patience. The species that once nearly vanished now carried a deeper understanding of survival. They respected the land that fed them. They honored the sky that warmed them. They watched the mountains that once shook the world. Humanity was no longer only a traveler. It was becoming a builder. And the future, once almost erased, now waited to be written. As the world opened itself once more, humanity began to settle into its rhythms. The long journey of survival slowly transformed into a life of belonging. People no longer moved only to escape hunger or cold. They began to return to the same valleys each year. They followed familiar rivers. They gathered beneath the same hills. Places became homes. Stone circles marked meeting grounds where clans gathered with the changing seasons. Caves became sanctuaries of memory, their walls painted with the shapes of animals and the shadows of hunters. Sacred fires burned where elders told stories of the world before the darkness. The past was no longer only a warning. It became a foundation. The memory of near extinction shaped the first traditions. People honored the sun when it rose above the hills. They sang for rain when the land grew dry. They offered thanks to the rivers that carried life through the plains. They remembered the silence of the sky. They remembered the hunger of the long winter. They remembered the thin thread that had once held the future of their species. These memories turned into ritual. At the turning of the seasons, families gathered to share food and stories. At the birth of a child, elders spoke of survival and strength. At the death of a hunter, the clan honored the path that had carried them through darkness. The earth was no longer only a place to endure. It was a world to understand. And in understanding, humanity began to build something new. Not yet cities, not yet kingdoms, but communities bound by memory, cooperation, and hope. The people who once walked on the edge of extinction now carried the seeds of civilization. Quietly, patiently, step by step. The world began to change. The earth had once shaped humanity. Now, slowly, humanity began to shape the earth. The people who had wandered for generations started to linger. They returned to the same valleys each year. They followed the same rivers with growing familiarity. They learned which lands were gentle and which were harsh. Fire became more than warmth. It became a tool. Stone was shaped not only for hunting, but for building. Wood was carved into frames and shelters that lasted beyond a single season. Paths were cleared through forests that once felt endless. The land began to remember human footsteps. Near rivers, camps grew larger. Near fertile plains, families stayed longer. Near forests, hunters learned every hidden trail. The old fear of extinction had not vanished, but it had transformed. It became caution. It became preparation. It became respect. Food was stored for the future. Shelters were strengthened against storms. Children were taught the knowledge of the land. The world was no longer only a place to survive. It was a place to build. Across the plains, small villages began to form. Along rivers, wooden homes rose from the soil. In valleys, stone walls marked gathering places. Humanity had stepped into a new age, not yet of kings and empires, but of roots. Roots in the land, roots in memory, roots in the future. The species that had once nearly vanished was now shaping the destiny of the planet. Quietly, carefully, with the wisdom of those who had seen the world fall silent. And far above, the sky watched, still vast, still powerful, still reminding humanity that survival is never guaranteed. Beyond the shadow of the past. For a long time, the memory of darkness had walked beside every step humanity took. It lingered in the way shelters were built. It lived in the care taken with fire. It shaped the way food was gathered and stored. But slowly, the shadow began to fade. The land no longer felt fragile. The seasons returned to their ancient rhythm. The sky once again carried the warmth of a living sun. The world felt stable. And with stability came confidence. Families no longer moved only with necessity. They stayed where the land was kind. They planted seeds where the soil was rich. They returned to the same fields year after year. The first gardens appeared along rivers. The first fields were cleared beside forests. The first villages grew where paths crossed. Humanity had found a new way to live. Not as wanderers following herds, but as keepers of the land. The memory of extinction became a quiet story, a lesson told to children, a warning whispered by elders, but no longer a fear that ruled every choice. The people built stronger homes. They raised walls of stone. They gathered in larger communities. The earth, once a place of endless danger, became a partner. Rivers carried water to fields. Forests offered wood and shelter. Mountains guarded fertile valleys. And humanity, once a fragile thread on a frozen world, now stood rooted beneath open skies. The long night had ended. The dawn of civilization had begun.
Yet somewhere in the depths of the planet, the forces that once reshaped the sky still slept. A reminder that the world is never truly still, and that the story of survival is never truly finished.
Even as villages grew into towns and fields spread across valleys, the memory of the ancient catastrophe never fully disappeared. It lived quietly beneath the surface of everyday life. In every culture, there were stories of a world that once burned, of a sky that once darkened, of a winter that lasted for generations. Some spoke of a great flood that washed away the old world. Others told of fire falling from the mountains. Many believed the sun had once hidden itself in sorrow. These were not only myths, they were echoes, fragments of memory carried across thousands of years, stories shaped by time but born from real fear. The people who built the first temples carved warnings into stone. The people who raised the first cities painted visions of fire and ice on their walls. The people who followed the first kings prayed to the sky and the earth alike. They knew the world could change. They knew the earth could awaken. And they knew that survival depended on respect for forces greater than any human hand. So they honored the sun. They thanked the rivers. They feared the mountains. They built their homes near water. They stored grain for dark seasons. They passed down knowledge like treasure. The long shadow of extinction had shaped them, not as a memory of weakness, but as a lesson of resilience. Humanity had stood at the edge of silence, and it had walked back. Every city, every road, every monument stood upon the bones of that forgotten age, a silent reminder. The world once almost forgot us, and we must never forget the world. A species forever changed. Humanity did not emerge from the long darkness as it had entered. The people who walked into the new world carried something new within them, a deeper awareness of fragility, a stronger instinct for cooperation, a quiet understanding that survival is never permanent. The ancient catastrophe had shaped the mind of the species. It taught them to plan beyond tomorrow. It taught them to prepare for unseen danger. It taught them to listen to the land and the sky. Where once humans had followed only hunger and warmth, now they followed wisdom. They built granaries to guard against famine. They raised walls against storms and flood. They studied the stars for signs of change. The earth had tested humanity, and humanity had answered, not with dominance, not with conquest, but with endurance, a quiet strength that would carry the species into the future. When the past was finally revealed. For thousands of years, the story of the Great Darkness lived only in memory. It lived in myths carved into stone. It lived in legends passed from parent to child. It lived in songs sung beside fading fires. But in the modern age, humanity began to search for the truth. Scientists climbed mountains where ice had slept for millennia. They drilled deep into glaciers that remembered ancient winters. They studied layers of ash buried beneath forests and oceans. And slowly, the earth began to speak. In the ice of Greenland and Antarctica, they found a thin gray line, a scar left by fire from the heart of the planet, a mark of a day when the sky turned dark across the world. In the soil of distant lands, they found the same ash, carried by winds across continents, falling into rivers, forests, and fields. The earth had kept its memory. The volcano had a name, Toba, a supervolcano whose eruption was so powerful it reshaped the climate of the planet, a fire so vast it darkened the sun for years, a winter so deep it nearly erased an entire species. Scientists traced its shadow through time. They saw the sudden cooling of the world. They saw the collapse of ecosystems. They saw the dramatic drop in human numbers. The myths were no longer only stories. They were echoes of truth. Humanity had not imagined the darkness. It had lived through it. The earth had nearly erased its youngest child. And yet, somehow, a few fragile communities had survived, not in comfort, not in safety, but in endurance. The past had finally revealed itself, not as legend, but as history.
The earth is quiet at night. Winds move through forests that once stood beneath ash-filled skies. Rivers follow paths carved long after the great cold retreated. Mountains rest where fire once reshaped the horizon. And across this vast and ancient world, billions of human lives now move in gentle rhythm. Cities glow beneath the stars, roads connect distant lands, voices carry across oceans. It is difficult to imagine a time when all of this almost never was. A time when the future of humanity balanced on a fragile thread. A time when only a few thousand people walked beneath a darkened sky. A time when one season more could have ended the story forever. But the earth remembered. It carried the ash in its soil. It sealed the cold into its ice. It preserved the silence in its stones. And humanity remembered too. In our caution, in our curiosity, in our endless desire to understand the world that shaped us. The great catastrophe did not end our story. It became its turning point. From fire and ice, humanity learned patience. From hunger and cold, humanity learned cooperation. From silence and darkness, humanity learned hope. The species that once walked on the edge of extinction now walks beneath satellites and stars. We build, we explore, we search the depths of oceans and the farthest reaches of space. And yet, beneath all our knowledge and power, lives a quiet truth. We are children of a fragile planet. We are guests on a world that is older and stronger than any civilization. We are survivors of a past that nearly erased us. The earth once tested us, and we endured. So, when you look up at the night sky, when you feel the wind move across the land, when you listen to rivers flowing through the dark, remember this. There was a day when humanity almost ended, and there was a day when humanity chose to continue.